Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for joining. I suspect we're going to have a lot of people joining us over the next 5 minutes, but we'll go ahead and get started. I'd like to welcome Michael Morell. Michael has served as the United States in numerous roles, including as the former Deputy Director of the CIA and twice Acting Director from 2009 to 2013. He's a 33-year veteran of the CIA, including time as the head of analysis and daily intelligence briefer to President George W. Bush. He is also the only person to be with President Bush on 9/11 and with President Obama on May 1st, 2011, when Osama bin Laden was brought to justice. Also joining us is Norman Menz, the CEO of Flare. Norman co-founded the third-party risk management provider Prevalent before joining AI-driven vulnerability management startup Delve as COO, which was later acquired by SecureWorks. Norman has extensive experience in external cyber risk management. Please put your questions in the Q&A section and not the chat, and I'll be selecting the best quotes, the best ones at the end. Norman, I will go ahead and turn it over to you.
Terrific. Thank you, Eric. Welcome, Michael. It's great to have you here today.
It is great to be with you, Norman. This is going to be fun. Thank you.
I'm looking forward to it. So we're excited, and we have a wide range of topics to cover in today's Q&A. Figured we'd provide an overview and a brief background on your roles within the CIA during what you title as the Great War of our time, borrowing from your book's title about the CIA's fight against terrorism. Then we want to touch on some more recent topics, including the Russian invasion of Ukraine, current tensions with Taiwan and China, and the US and NATO responses to emerging threats. And then we'll conclude with some recommendations that maybe you have for this audience, and then open it up, as Eric talked about, for live Q&A with questions from the audience.
Great.
You ready to get started?
Yeah, let's go.
Let's go. Excellent. So, Michael, when we were chatting previously about your time in the CIA, it's easy to perceive why you might be called the Forrest Gump of the CIA, occupying essentially every role. Can you share a brief overview of your career in the CIA and the many years that you spent in what you've described in your book as the CIA analyst's dream job as the daily briefer of the president?
Sure. So I spent 33 years there. I grew up on the analytic side of the agency. So there's basically two sides to the agency. There's an analytic side that takes all the information that's available to the US government and tries to make sense of what's going on in the world for the president. And then there's an operational side that whose job is to collect information clandestinely. So most of that is done by recruiting other human beings to spy for the United States, and some of it is done by clandestine technical means, like putting a bug right somewhere. So basically two sides of the agency. I grew up on the analytic side. I spent the first, out of 33 years, I spent the first 16 years of my career being an analyst and a manager of analysts on East Asia. So I pretty much worked on every different part of East Asia, which is actually a good thing now when people ask me questions about China, right? I got some background on that. But after that period of time working on Asia, and there were some interesting things in there. I was a member of the team, a very small member, but I was a member of the team that discovered the North Korean nuclear weapons program way back in the early 1990s. But after that, I started a series of staff jobs, so senior staff jobs. So I ran the staff that produced the president's daily brief when Bill Clinton was president. Then I served for 2 years as George Tenet's executive assistant. So in both of those jobs, right, in that first job, I saw everything the agency was telling President Clinton. And then with George, I saw not only everything CIA was doing, both analytically and operationally, but I saw what the entire intelligence community was doing, because at that point, the head of the agency was also the head of the community. And then I went back and worked as a senior manager again. But then George Tenet asked me to be George Bush's first intelligence briefer. So I was his briefer from January 4th, 2001 to January 4th, 2002. So, an amazing year. Being with the president 6 days a week, no matter where he was in the world, helping to shape his worldview, answering his questions, I learned a tremendous amount about what seniors, in an administration need from the intelligence community. And then I really continued, with a series of staff jobs. So I was in London and I was our senior analytic representative to the British analytic community, which is a great job because we share everything with the Brits. So I did that. And then I came back, and Mike Hayden was then the director of the agency, and he asked me to be his number 3. It's called the associate deputy director, which is the job of managing the business of the agency. So think budget, HR, security, including cybersecurity, all of those kind of things. So away from the substance. That was a tough year for me because I'm really, all about the substance. But I did learn a lot, about running an organization. And then the job of the head of analysis came open, and I went to the director and I said, I'd love to have that job. And he said, that's actually a step down, right? You're the number 3 here. And I said, I don't care, right? That is the job that I, have aspired to. And so I did that job for 2 years, both the day-to-day and trying to, build capability so that my successor would be even more successful than I was. And then Leon Panetta came to the agency and he asked me to be his deputy, and I was his deputy. I was Dave Petraeus's deputy, and I was John Brennan's deputy for a while. So about 4 years in total. And then twice in that period, I was acting director. So I had a great career, and and this, first half focused on East Asia, second half really focused on terrorism, because that's what dominated our attention, right, during that post 9/11 period.
Yeah, absolutely. So, Michael, we're going to get into the seriousness of 9/11 in a second, but going back to your book, I thought there were two. There was a number of stories, but you were talking about the personalities both of George Tenet and his kind of boisterous personality, I think you could describe. And then you also told some stories too about your initial interactions with George W. Bush. And there was a story in particular that had to deal with light bulbs in Texas. And maybe before we get into some of the serious stuff, maybe you'd share 1 or 2 stories if you wouldn't mind there.
Yeah. So very senior people are human beings, right? And we sometimes forget that. People have different levels of humanity, but George Bush had a ton of it. We did a briefing one day in January of 2001. So he wasn't president yet, at his ranch in Texas. And at that point, we were in the old house on the ranch, and they were just building the new house. Okay. And so he and I were in the old house, and we were in the middle of the briefing, and his cell phone rang. And it was, it was the first lady. I didn't know that at the time, but it was the first lady calling him. And he was on the phone for literally 10 seconds, and he hangs up, and he looks at me, and he said, Michael, the most important thing that you're going to do today is, when this briefing is over, not let me forget to take the light bulbs from this house over to the new house. That was the first lady. So there were like many moments like that. I walked into his ranch one morning, and he was straightening up, straightening magazines and putting pillows, back up. And I said, Mr. President, it's good to see that a president of the United States, has to keep house, right? And he said, pal, you don't know my wife. So we used to, at the ranch, we used to eat breakfast before the briefing, and we would talk about baseball, and we would actually have to wash the dishes before we could, start the briefing, because the first lady was so demanding of, keeping the place clean. So he was a normal husband, in those moments.
Yeah, that's great. So Laura Bush was demanding of her husband, and it sounds like when George Bush came in and you started working with him, he really asked your team to up their game in terms of the intelligence that you were providing.
Yeah, we had quite a moment. had quite a moment on my first briefing day. So before I started, the people who were running the analytics side of the agency were taking turns briefing him. So the first day I briefed him, the actual head of analysis was with me. And at the end of the briefing that I gave, with my boss watching me, the president said, hey guys, I guess when I'm president, I'm going to start seeing the good stuff, which was, kind of some direct feedback, right? And I look at my boss, who looks at me like, and we have a look on our face like, this is the good stuff. But then he was very powerful in setting expectations. He said at that moment, he said, look, he said, I expect two things of you guys. I expect that there are people in the world who are doing things that undermine the national security of the United States. I expect you guys to find out what those are and tell me. And then number two, I'm going to make a lot of decisions as president, and my expectation is that you fully inform every one of those decisions, which is, it's just a fantastic way of a mission statement for the collection side, and then a mission statement for the analytics side of the agency.
Yeah.
And I found over time that he would kind of raise the bar on me. So I showed him one morning a report from one of our chiefs of station in the Middle East, who had sat down with the leader of that country and had a quite long conversation. And he had written up this report, and there were some really interesting things he had said about Saddam Hussein. And I thought this was kind of cool to show him this. And so he read it and he handed it back to me, and he said, Michael, that's great, what the leader told your chief of station. But what I really want to know is, what is that leader saying to Saddam Hussein? Yeah. Not what is he saying about Saddam Hussein to me, right? Mm-hmm. Takes the bar from here, right, way up here.
Absolutely.
I made a mistake once, and I told him it was hard to collect intelligence in North Korea. And he said, I don't care if it's hard. I know it's hard, but I expect you to do it. So he was very demanding, but he did it in a way that made you feel very comfortable, and in a way that you didn't want to let him down, right? He built this personal relationship with people, and when he was demanding, you didn't want to let him down, so you worked really hard.
Yeah. Now, as Eric mentioned, and as you talked about extensively in your book, you were with President Bush, of course, on September 11th. Could you tell us what that was like?
Yeah, I mean, it's riveted in my mind as if it were yesterday, right? But if I were going to sum it up, I'd say it was a mixture of the intensity of doing my job with the surreal. So, a couple of examples of the intensity of doing my job. After we left Sarasota, after the attacks, we left Sarasota, we were flying around the Gulf of Mexico, not sure where we were going to go, not sure what to do. And the president asked to see me. And so I joined him in his rather small office on Air Force One. And so it was the president, it was me, and it was Andy Card, the president's chief of staff at the time. And the president looked me in the eye and he said, Michael, who did this? Kind of direct question you get from a president. Michael, who did this? And I told him, I hadn't seen any intelligence yet that would take us to a perpetrator. So he was going to get my kind of best assessment, right? Not facts. And he said, I understand the caveat, now move on. Very kind of George Bush thing. And so I said, Mr. President, your mind might go to, Iran and Iraq, right? Both adversaries of the United States. But I said, neither one of those countries have anything to gain, and both of them have everything to lose from doing something like this. So I told him when we get to the end of the trail, I was certain that we were going to find Al-Qaeda and we were going to find bin Laden. And I told him I was so confident in that judgment that I would bet my children's future on it. I've never told them that. Then he looked me in the eye and he said, when will we know? Which is, not a question for which there's a direct answer. So I drew on what what analysts call context. So I provided him context. I told him about attacks in the past against the United States, terrorist attacks, and how long it took us to find out. So I said East Africa bombings, literally 2 days to find out it was Al-Qaeda. The bombing of the USS Cole off the coast of Yemen, I said 2 to 3 months.
Yeah.
Bombing of the marine housing complex in Saudi Arabia, Khobar Towers, took us a year to find out that the Iranians were behind that. So I laid out all that context, right? And I said, so Mr. President, we may know soon, or it may take some time. So, that's one example. Another example is, as we were heading back to Washington, the CIA sent me a intelligence report that a West European government had given to us.
Okay.
And the sourcing on it wasn't clear. So no idea how much confidence to put in it, but George Tenet wanted me to show it to the president. And so here's a guy, Norman, who just suffered the biggest attack in the history of the country and the homeland. And I have a piece of paper I'm showing him where I tell him, I don't know about the sourcing on this, right? But it says what happened today is the first of 2 waves of attacks on the United States. Example of the surreal, just one here. So as we were landing that night at Andrews Air Force Base, the president's military aide, the officer who carries the nuclear football, was looking out the windows on the left side of the aircraft, and he saw me looking at him, and we'd become friends during the previous 9 months. And he waved me to come over. So I went over, I looked out the window, and there was an F-16 on the wingtip. And he said, F-16, DC Air National Guard. There's another one on the other wingtip. And Norman, it was so close that you could see the pilot, you could see the pilot's facial features, and you could see the pilot looking at us. And in the distance, you could see the still smoldering Pentagon. And then the president's military aide said something to me that literally to this day still sends shivers up my spine. He said, do you know what their job is? And I couldn't think of it because every commercial airliner, had been grounded, right? So the only planes in the air were military planes. And he said, their job is, if someone fires a surface-to-air missile at us on final approach, their job is to put themselves between that missile and the president of the United States.
Yeah.
Like,
wow.
wow. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I see some of the comments in the chat too. Obviously, people are reliving the moments here, and it was obviously it was a huge, as you said, it was the biggest attack on homeland. Certainly a big paradigm shift in terms of the way, I think, as you talked about, the intelligence community was seeing a lot of chatter, and there were a lot of, I think George Tenet described it as all the alarm bells were going off leading up to that. And I think it's obviously changed and shaped the way that the intelligence community has responded, and just security in general, whether it's airlines, et cetera. If we look at other paradigm shifts, though, and kind of moving a little bit away from that, and now maybe focusing to something a little bit more recently, like the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Just curious, I mean, it's as we were talking about just earlier, a few minutes before the webinar started, there's a lot going on, right? And there's a lot of things changing. And I'd love to get your perspective on where do you think it's headed? Have you been, and then, from an overall military and geopolitical perspective, where is it headed? So make it a 2-part question. And then to tie it back to cybersecurity, if you could maybe spend a couple minutes talking about, some of the lack of, let's call it offensive cybersecurity that we're potentially seeing from Russia right now. Certainly, we've seen it directed at Ukraine at the beginning of the war, but there hasn't been a lot of public talk. And I'm just wondering if you have any perspective on whether or not perhaps they're overwhelmed, or there's much happening outside of the public view that we're not aware of.
Yeah. Okay. So maybe let's start with, where are we in the war? We're now in phase 3. So phase 1 was the Russian attempt to overrun the entire country, right, in a very short period of time. And we know that the Ukrainians fought that off, right, in a pretty remarkable way. Both both deficiencies on the Russian military side and really capable leadership on the Ukrainian side and tremendous motivation, right? As you said earlier when we were talking, you're fighting for your country, right? Literally, existentially, right? So that was phase one. Phase two was when Russia shifted their tactical objectives, right, from taking the whole country now to taking just the eastern portion of the country and worrying about the rest of the country later. And that was essentially a stalemate. The Russians gained a little bit of ground from where they started this war. They started the war already in Ukraine, which they went in 2014. So they already held portions of Ukraine. So they took a little bit more, but basically it was a stalemate. Mm-hmm. We're now in phase three, which is the Ukrainians for the first time on the offensive. And two different pictures of that offensive. In the northeast, the Ukrainians are doing exceptionally well, largely because the Russians are cutting and running. Literally, they're not standing and fighting. So thousands of square miles of territory regained in the northeast. The fighting in the south, actually much harder. That's where the bulk of the Russian forces are. That's where the bulk of the defenses are. And so they're fighting tougher. The death count is the casualty count is largely in Russia's favor in the south. So completely different military picture, right? But what happened as a result of those huge Ukrainian gains in the north is that supporters of Putin back in Russia, actually ultra nationalists, started criticizing him. And these are his biggest supporters, and started criticizing him not for starting the war, but for not being aggressive enough in fighting it. And so he actually had to acknowledge, the Kremlin actually acknowledged their losses in the north, really for the first time. And they blamed the Ministry of Defense, and they blamed Putin's military advisors inside the Kremlin. And Putin himself has now acknowledged it. And as you know, the news in recent days has called up 300,000 reservists. So these are people who previously served in the Russian military, and he's calling them up again. The reason he didn't do a mobilization earlier is because he was afraid of the politics at home, which we saw immediately yesterday and the day before, that politics playing out, right? Strong protests against where this war is headed. So now there's essentially two wars for Putin. Now there's a war in Ukraine, and now he's got a war at home, right? Mm-hmm. And you're going to see more protests. You're going to see repression of those protests, and you're going to see more and more dissent. And I actually think we're at the most dangerous time in the war, because as dissent rises in Russia, and if Putin begins to feel like his political back is against the wall, he will be incentivized to use weapons of mass destruction in Ukraine, including a tactical nuclear weapon in Ukraine, to again get the advantage on the battlefield, or more likely to force a negotiation and a ceasefire so he can rebuild a little bit. The use of tactical nuclear weapons is actually in their military doctrine for just this kind of situation. So obviously it would be a huge step, but people who I respect, who are Russia experts, who 3 months ago, 2-3 months ago, we're putting the probability of the use of tactical nuclear weapons at 1%, are now putting it at 20 to 25.
It's concerning to hear you say that, Michael. I mean, you look at you look at all of the media. A lot of people say it's rhetoric, coming, and maybe it's built up as rhetoric, but it's to hear you put it in such a finite point is alarming.
Yeah, I just interviewed for my podcast today. It hasn't run yet, but I just interviewed for my podcast today the deputy director of CIA, and I asked him the very question, right? Is this just intimidation, or do we actually have to worry about him using these weapons? And he didn't say it directly, but the message was clear. We got to worry about this. And he also said that the intelligence community has not yet seen the movement of any tactical nuclear weapons. So it sounded as if he was quite confident that they would see the movement of those weapons. You know, they're not stored locally, right?
Mm-hmm.
They're going to have to be moved to the forces that would fire the mortars and rockets that would carry these things. So, you know, that's a little bit of good news there, I guess.
Yeah. Wow. Amazing. And then, Michael, what about the cybersecurity side of it? Given the scope of this conversation, is that relevant?
Yeah, it is absolutely relevant. So as you know, they've been aggressive. They've been aggressive in Ukraine, and there is, I think it's fair to say, a shadow war going on the cyber front inside Ukraine. So the Russians trying to do quite a bit, and the U.S., the U.K., perhaps some other countries really making an effort to make that extraordinarily difficult. In terms of cyber attacks on the West, we haven't seen those. And people say, whoa, why haven't we seen those? And I think the reason is that Putin wants to avoid escalation as much as we do. Right? He does not want the U.S. more involved in this fight. He's struggling enough, with just the Ukrainians. And so he wants to avoid escalation. And I think that the decision not to get overly aggressive on cyber inside the United States or inside the UK or France or Germany is a reflection of his desire to minimize escalation.
That makes sense. The flip side of it, though, is what we have seen, especially coordinated and both uncoordinated. We've seen a lot of what you might either call hacktivism or non-state-sponsored actors getting together, attacking both Russian cyber as well as assets, as well as Belarus and some other countries in protest.
Right.
Have you experienced anything like this? Either at a cyber or otherwise, that was both distributed yet fairly effective and coordinated?
Yeah. So no, this is the first time I've seen, hackers, right, come together to do good, right? I've seen plenty of hackers inside the government, right, at NSA and CIA that were doing good, right? But it's unusual to see private hackers doing good. But I think it's also, right, it's also consistent with some of the other things we've seen in this war, right? Normal citizens using their iPhones to take a picture of Russian forces and then geolocating that, right, and providing that information. So we're seeing average people, right, contributing to this war in ways that is quite unusual, but certainly a reflection of the new technology that we all have available to us.
Yeah, there was a story about a young boy who was doing even something similar, and then providing intelligence and even through the use of his drone to the Ukrainian military, which they were using to some effect. Right. Yeah. And we've definitely seen a lot of that. And I think that's interesting, because that's probably the true intersection of, traditional physical military presence, cyber warfare, and now the use of technology there.
Right. Exactly.
Yeah. Michael, if we shift gears a little bit, and we can stay on the same topic, but really of the emerging kind of global threats, we'd love your perspective in terms of what's going on in Taiwan and China right now, both from an overall geopolitical perspective, and then even from what we might expect from like some type of a cyber conflict, if you think that might be the first salvo, so to speak, or might we see something that's more physical in nature?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think the way to talk about this is to say, for a long time, the dynamics in the three key countries here, China, the United States, and Taiwan, favored stability in the Taiwan Straits. On Taiwan, there was a political differentiation between those who saw a future without China and the old KMT party, which actually wanted unification with China just on Taiwan's terms. So there was a dynamic there that said, hey, we can see ourselves as part of China again, right? And it's kind of like open to negotiation. And in China, there was a view that Taiwan could be encouraged back into the fold using economics, or at minimum coerced back into the fold. And so there was not as much aggression on the Chinese part. And in the United States, we were firm with regard to the one China policy, that we recognize China as a country, and we do not recognize Taiwan as a country. And we were firm in our policy of strategic ambiguity under which we would defend Taiwan, right? We wouldn't say what conditions would lead us to defend Taiwan and which would not. And that was important because we didn't want to encourage Taiwan to declare independence, knowing we would come to their aid, nor did we want to say we wouldn't defend Taiwan and kind of give China, right, a green light, right? So all of those things were stable. All of those things have now broken down. So in Taiwan, the public attitudes have moved towards, the polling is really weird on this because people don't want to say, I want to be independent now. They talk about wanting to be independent sometime down the road. But the number of people who say they want to be independent sometime down the road has really risen over time. And the old KMT is really struggling to be a viable political party. So that dynamic on Taiwan has completely changed. And that's a reflection of their pride at their economic success and their success at democracy, and quite frankly, at what happened in Hong Kong. It wasn't so much that China took it over and passed the national security law. It was more in terms of what happened. People were arrested, journalists were arrested, opposition people were arrested and thrown in jail, sometimes without trial. So it was really the treatment of Hong Kong citizens who were in any way questioning China that really got the attention of Taiwan. So that's what happened on Taiwan. And then in terms of China, a growing belief that peaceful reunification is not going to be possible. And at the same time, Xi Jinping saying that his main policy is what he calls national rejuvenation, right? Which is essentially saying China getting back what it lost over the last century. It used to be the dominant force in East Asia, right? With them being kind of the king and everybody else kind of being a vassal state. That's what national rejuvenation means. And he specifically said that national rejuvenation includes reunification with Taiwan, right? So now you've got a changed dynamic in China, and as a result of that, much more aggressive behavior. So many more military, flights and activities by the Chinese Navy, just being very aggressive vis-a-vis Taiwan. And then in the United States, now you see people questioning the one China policy. You see people questioning strategic ambiguity. In fact, President Biden now has said, I don't know how many times, that we will defend Taiwan, right? So the dynamic here that led to stability is breaking down. So that's what's creating this tension. Now, is China going to invade anytime soon? No, they're not ready. There are two things that they need that they don't have. They don't have the amphibious lift capability. You read about them putting troops on fishing boats, right? That's ridiculous. It's not going to happen. They need to build the amphibious lift capability to move, hundreds of thousands of troops. They don't have that yet. And the second thing they don't have is they don't have as many nuclear weapons as they want. So they used to have less than 100 nuclear weapons. They just wanted enough to make sure that nobody attacked them with nuclear weapons. But now they want not parity, but they want enough nuclear weapons that we couldn't take them out in a first strike. So they want to be able, sometime in the future to threaten us with nuclear weapons the way Vladimir Putin is threatening us with nuclear weapons, right? So those are the two things they need, they don't have. The expectation is that they'll have those by 2027.
Okay.
So, and on the other side, right, so that's kind of the first moment in which they would think about attacking and winning with some confidence, right? Because the last thing you want if you're a Chinese leader is to attempt an attack and fail. Your political history at that point, right? So they got to be pretty sure that this is going to be successful. So that window opens, later this decade, but then it probably closes in the early 2030s because the US is making investments that will make us much more effective in fighting them. And those will start kicking in the early 2030s. So you've got this window, say from 2027 to 2032, which I think most people are worried about. In the meantime, between now and 2027, what's likely? These moments of tension, like we saw with Speaker Pelosi's visit. So if Republicans win this fall and Kevin McCarthy is the speaker, he's going to Taiwan. And you will see an aggressive Chinese response to that. Right? There'll be these moments of tension. The only way war would start now, between now and 2027, is if Taiwan did something, if Taiwan made a strategic mistake like declaring independence, or if the US made a strategic mistake like changing its one China policy. Then the Chinese would go now. They would feel that. So between now and 2027, war happens. War starts in Taipei or Washington. Post 2027, likelihood goes up of the war starting with a decision by Beijing.
Got it. It's a stark contrast when you talk about the Chinese nuclear capability in terms of the number of weapons that they may have available to them and what their identified goals are. I was listening to a documentary the other day, and they said that the Russians have something like 38,000, I think, and I don't know if that number is accurate, as of today. But it's a stark contrast between the hundreds you're talking about and the tens of thousands potentially. Right. Given that, and given that it's I don't want to put too many words into your mouth, but it's unlikely unless there's some major change in policy that we'll see a physical attack of Taiwan. Where do you think the cyber warfare game will play out, both in, targeted at Taiwan and then maybe at the West as well?
Yeah. So in the initial, I think about this two different ways. So in an attack scenario, so where China is actually attacking Taiwan with the purpose of putting its forces on the island, right? That war begins with two things. That war begins with a huge cyber attack on Taiwan, not in the United States, because we haven't yet made a decision, right, whether we're going to come to their aid, and why would China want to bring us into the fight, right? So, but a massive cyber attack on Taiwan and a massive attack on US satellites using China's considerable anti-satellite capabilities to take out our ability to see and to communicate with our forces in the Pacific. So that would be the beginning of a war scenario. There's another scenario that people talk about, which if China was forced to act prior to 2027, this is probably what we would see. And the military exercises that were done in response to the Pelosi visit, this is what they were practicing: a blockade. So you encircle Taiwan with naval vessels, and you protect those naval vessels with fighter aircraft. And you, the Chinese, say to the world, we're going to inspect every ship that's coming from and going to Taiwan. And if it's general trade, we'll let it go. But if it's weapons coming from the United States, we're going to shut those off. or if it's high technology coming from the United States or somewhere else that Taiwan needs for its weapon systems, we're not going to let that in. How would we respond to that, right? Would we start the war? Because they haven't started a war yet, right? They haven't fired a shot. That would be very difficult for the United States to deal with. In that scenario, I don't think there's a cyber attack.
Okay.
But a cyber attack is definitely, using their considerable capabilities, a cyber attack is in the attack scenario.
What about the, and maybe a quick response to this one, but if we look at Taiwan as a large producer of semiconductors and the impact that we've seen over, whether it be COVID or other global events on that industry, that I think the Chinese could potentially use to their advantage as well, right? To create pressure globally.
Yeah. So, semiconductors are really important here, obviously. As everybody knows, TSMC is the most sophisticated semiconductor producer on the planet. So this is interesting. So the first point I'd make is there are some people who believe this is why China wants Taiwan. And it's not. This Chinese desire for Taiwan is historical. They believe it's theirs. Every Chinese citizen that I've ever talked to has told me they would go to war to keep Taiwan in the fold, and if necessary, bring it back into the fold. They're deeply, deeply nationalistic on this issue, and it's not because they want those semiconductors. Indeed, what could well happen, right, is the semiconductor manufacturing fabrication facilities could be damaged in a war. But much more likely is that the talent that runs those facilities would leave, right? They come to the West. And I think China knows this. So an attack by China on Taiwan, I think the Chinese know that what they would be getting, what they'd be gaining in terms of a semiconductor manufacturing capability might be less than what most people think. Okay. Because certainly the facilities matter, but the people probably matter more, right? The engineering and the technical folks who run all that stuff. I think many of those people would leave, and it would be difficult for the Chinese to replace them. So this is not about semiconductors. Obviously, in an attack scenario, there'd be a huge shortage of semiconductors, for quite some period of time. That would, significantly disrupt, supply chains around the world.
Yeah, interesting. Certainly, we've all been affected by the supply chain disruptions lately, so we'll keep an eye on that one. Mike, I wanted to make my last final question for you before we open up to the audience for their Q&A. And given that the large number of people, we have both public and private sector, but largely private sector, what recommendations or guidance could you give to cybersecurity teams, cybersecurity executives about things that they should be doing, notably in the private sector, potentially to either to look out for or to protect their organizations?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, look, I'd say number one, don't wait for the U.S. government to come to the rescue, right? This is on the private sector to deal with themselves. The U.S. government's not going to ride in on a white horse, right, with the solution to your cybersecurity problems. Not going to happen. Two is, as you guys know better than anybody, this is not a one-time fix, right? That the adversaries are always adapting, that offense is always adapting. Offense gets to move first. So you have to keep your defense up, right? This is an ongoing daily challenge, right? In terms of adapting to what the adversary is doing and adjusting our defenses accordingly, right? So nobody should think that, there's a solution you can put in place that's going to be there that's going to work forever, right? And then the third thing I'd say is that, and this is more for senior executives, is that this is not something that they can leave to their security teams, right? This is a risk. This is a serious risk to their business, right? In a lot of different ways, from their ability to operate to all the way to losing intellectual property, right? So this is a serious risk that every company faces. And therefore they need to think about it and about that. They need to think about it the way they think about every other risk, right? Boards should be fluent in cybersecurity and be able to ask the same kind of questions about cybersecurity that they do about financial audits, for example, right? Or the risks associated with X, Y, or Z, right? That's not something you leave to a CISO or to even a CIO, right? You gotta take ownership at the leadership level inside your company, just like you do with every other significant risk you face. And then the other thing I'd say is I've been on some boards where we have Michael, so we're okay on that on cyber, right? No, every member of the board, right, has to get smart on cyber. And every member of the leadership team has to get smart on cyber. That's what I'd say.
Yeah, Michael, I think those are four great points. And looking at the audience feedback, I think people agree. But I think you touched on a point that's always dear to me. I describe cybersecurity defensively as being like dirt track racing versus Formula One, right? It just continuously goes on and on and on, and you have to be resilient. So very, very well said. Let's hand it over to Eric. Eric, I think you've got some questions you're going to moderate from the audience.
Yeah, I was going to say thank you both for the excellent discussion. And then I have a few questions in our last 10 minutes. So I'm going to start with, do you think China's COVID zero policy is diminishing their capability to engage in a conflict over Taiwan?
No, I don't, because the zero COVID policy will be short term. And it feels long term, right? But in the construct I laid out earlier of late this decade, early next decade in terms of an attack, hopefully COVID will be far behind us. So no, I don't think it'll impact them.
All right, the next question I have for you. What do you think of Biden claiming for the second time that the US would come to Taiwan's defense, breaking the strategic ambiguity policies of the past?
Yeah, so he's now said it 6 times, not just twice, he said it 6 times. And by the way, every time he said it, the White House has quickly backtracked. So, the formal policy hasn't changed, but when your president says 6 times that will come to the aid, it sounds certainly to the Chinese like we've changed our policy. And I think that's one of the reasons why we saw them so aggressive, why we saw their response so aggressive in response to the Pelosi visit. They actually fired ballistic missiles over Taipei. They actually fired ballistic missiles into Japan's special economic zone. And when the Japanese said publicly, that must have been, missiles off course, right? They would never fire into our special economic zone. The Chinese quickly said, no, it's exactly what we intended, right? You're way too close to the United States on this issue. So, very aggressive reaction, I think, in part because of the dynamic that the Chinese are seeing in Washington. And that in part a reflection of what President Biden is saying. And if you're the Chinese, right, and you hear him say that, and then you see the White House backtrack, who do you believe? Who do you believe? Right? You believe the president. You don't believe some unnamed White House official, right, who corrects the record. So it might make us feel good, but the Chinese read it in a very, very different way.
Excellent, thank you. Here's the next one I have for you. What are the chances that China and Russia have gained access into public and private infrastructure? I'm guessing the context of the question is cybersecurity. So advanced persistent threats, right? They have malware and things like that already installed, and it's kind of, they're just waiting to trigger it.
Yeah, so, there's no doubt that if we had a hot war with either China or Russia, that they would, as part of that hot war, attack our infrastructure, right? Energy, finance, telecommunications. And as part of the preparations for that, I'm absolutely certain that they're probing, and when they find avenues in, even placing malware that they can come back to later. So there is a preparation of the battlefield, on their part for attacking critical infrastructure. And one of the things that we need to do as a country, right, is to make sure that we make it as difficult as possible for them to prep that battlefield, and make it easy for companies to find any preparation of the battlefield that's been done and get it out. So I think it's pretty much part of every country's preparation for cyber war, right? To probe the things you want to attack.
Excellent. I think this question kind of goes into that one as well. Given the difference in maturity of critical infrastructure between the US and Ukraine, does Ukraine's successes against Russian cyber attacks, does Ukraine's resilience to US cyber attacks also apply to the US even more so possibly? So I think, is the United States a harder target to hack than Ukraine? And the second part of that question would be, has Russia held back against Ukraine to some degree with the cyber attacks that they'd be capable of?
So I think in general, I don't know specifically with regard to cyber, but in general, Russia has held back. There's much more that Russia could have done. And that's what these ultra-nationalist bloggers are complaining about. Can the US better defend itself than Ukraine? Yes. But I go back to an earlier point. I do think there's a shadow war that's been going on, with Cybercom and GCHQ, battling the Russians in Ukraine. And, our offensive capabilities for defensive purposes, right? The use of cyber offense to protect us from cyber attacks is quite sophisticated. In the 2018 election, Cybercom was very active in protecting us from Russian cyber attacks on the 2018 election. And I think those capabilities have just grown over time. So yeah, there would be a fight, in a hot war. We should not assume that China or Russia would win on the cyber front. There would be a battle, and that's a good thing.
Excellent. I have one last question for you, Michael. Do you have any idea what Putin's end game was when he started the war in Ukraine? And then I'm going to add an extra part. What would his end game be now?
It's a great question. So his end game when he started was either to eliminate Ukraine as a state, in other words, incorporate Ukraine into Russia, or to drive out the current regime in Kiev and install a puppet regime that, in essence, made Russia a vassal state. Not exactly clear which one of those two it was. The outcome is essentially the same in terms of denying the Ukrainians the self-determination they want and the future they want, which is a future tied to the West. But that's what he wanted when he started. What does he want today? He wants exactly the same thing. So his strategic objectives have not changed, but his tactical objectives have. So when he couldn't overrun the country in the initial weeks, he said, okay, I'll go back to the east and I'll take part of the country now, and then figure out my next move going forward. He thinks he's got all the time in the world here, right? It's going to take a decade to rebuild his army now, but he first invaded Ukraine in 2014 and he comes back in 2022. So if he were to win the Donbass region, if he were to win the region in the east that is largely Russian speaking, he can go away for another 8 to 10 years and come back. So his overall objective remains the same, but I think his tactical objective now, given his military situation and his political situation at home, I think his tactical objective now is to get himself a ceasefire and a negotiated settlement that freezes the lines where they are, and this becomes a kind of like a frozen conflict, the way you have in, say, Georgia, that allows him to declare at least a partial victory at home, gets the politics off his back, but also allows him the time he needs to rebuild his forces to fight another day. So I think there's a difference in his mind between strategic objectives and tactical objectives.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much, Michael. We really appreciate you joining us. And I know the audience had lots of great questions. I am going to turn it over to Norman briefly, just so he can quickly describe what FLAIR does for folks who may not be familiar with us. And we'll wrap it up there.
Thank you, Eric. And, before we do that, Michael, thank you again for being here with us today. I think we could have spent hours on all of these topics, and we really just touched the surface. But more importantly, just appreciate your deep insight and your knowledge. Thank you for your service. And as we were talking about earlier, Michael did a great job in his book, really just thanking all of the unsung heroes, if you will, of the intelligence community that don't get recognized. But we're glad that Michael had an opportunity to share his experience with us here today and give us some insight that's, I think, is unique. Talking a bit about FLAIR, one of the missions at FLAIR is to democratize cybersecurity, and I think it's apropos to do this type of knowledge sharing event amongst the community of security professionals. But if you look at what we do at FLAIR, we have a platform, a cybersecurity platform that monitors the dark and the clear web for any type of leakage into and of your organization's digital footprint. And so we provide real-time alerting and information, anytime information about your organization or any type of targeted attacks that are occurring directed at your organization, either by inadvertent employee disclosure, people making bad life decisions, as some people say, leaking information about your organization, which is happening about 80% of the time. And then the other 20% of the threats that we're seeing in customers' digital footprints are coming from malicious actors. So if you'd like to talk to us a little bit about what we're doing to help our customers identify risk and mitigate that risk, we'd love to talk to you about FLAIR. But again, as a wrap up, Michael, thank you again very much. Any parting comments before we end here?
No, it's been great to be with everybody today. And, thank you guys for the invitation.
Yeah. All right, Michael. Well, thank you again so much. And thank you everybody for attending. Thank you for your great questions, and please keep up the good fight as well.
Thank you.
Thank you.